I think a good place to start is right here with the Artist Illustrated Encyclopedia. This is a book put together and written by a guy named Phil Metzger. Now, Phil Metzger hadn't touched anything to do with art until after he was 40 years old. So when he turned 40, he got a gift from his wife, and he decided, I think it was watercolors, and he decided he wanted to figure everything out about art. And what he did was he quit his job at IBM and decided to put together a book. He was also, a decent writer, so he put together this book, which is a really, really fantastic book if you want to learn things like techniques, materials, and terminology. So I just want to cover a little bit of this book here, and then we'll go through these others. So thanks for joining today, and let's take a look. So when you open this book up, it's got a nice index and things like that to kind of tell you where to go and what to look at if you're interested in finding that stuff. But one of the first things you notice that he basically covers almost everything. Now, it'd be impossible even in a 12-volume set to cover every possible thing in art, but Phil Metzger did a really good job, and he starts like art movements. So if you wanted to know about like a period of time and what's that called and what the style of art is, I mean, a lot of us know about Art Nouveau or Impressionist art or abstract or realism, but this goes through all of the different schools of art. And there's the Empire style, the Hudson River, post-impressionism, Raphaelites, and the 8, the 10, these are different artist groups that formed and kind of had their own art style. And then he goes into some detail about those as well. So, just general information. And then here you get to this section, and he talks all about brushes. Have you ever wondered about the terminology of brushes? Why do they call that a flat? Or why do they call that a bright or a filbert? Where did that name come from? Things like that. What is a fan brush and what is it used for? Well, Metzger really goes into detail on that and talks a lot about how that those things are used. I mean, and by detail, I mean he gives it a full paragraph and sometimes more to talk about stuff. But I think it's also important to recognize that he has examples in here and pictures, which really help a lot. There's a whole section on calligraphy. Want to know what calligraphy is? Things like that. Let's go here, skip ahead. This is like charcoal drawing, how to draw trees with charcoal. Not exactly how to, but the materials you use and what it might look like. And here's an example. Flip ahead here. Here's more about talks about chiaroscuro, which is, defines it and then talks about how light and shadow are really important in art. Let's skip ahead a little bit here. Then have you ever wondered, I'd like to learn more about what is a color wheel and why is it important and what are primary and complementary, secondary colors all about? Well, Metzger goes into that here and talks a lot about it in pretty layman's terms because he's coming at this from the point of not understanding much about art. He was 40 years old. He had never taken an art class or been interested in art whatsoever, but he decided to do a huge deep dive, and this book is a result, and we have him to thank for that. He talks a lot about perspective, which in this book, the definitions are given in really understandable terms and with examples, which I really like. And I like when artists and authors try to break things down into understandable and easy to grasp terminology and things like that. But there's just a whole, everything you can think of is covered here. I think what I like is I was learning about etching and different types of etching from a friend of mine, Stuart Lockridge. He's an artist who does a lot of etching. And I was surprised to find out how many different types of etching there were and how they're done and what they're made of. And so he devotes a whole section to that. And then he talks about like the materials and how it's done and how things work that way and what kind of, what is the difference between a soft ground etching and, maybe a hard ground etching. And then, of course, the equipment involved in etching, which is really kind of cool. And he does the same thing for like wood block art and stuff like that. But here's another example of he's talking about reflection and giving you visual examples, which are really, really nice to see and have. The book goes through a lot of different areas, including touching on sketchbooks. What are sketchbooks? How can you use a sketchbook? What types of materials might you use in a sketchbook? What kind of things might you draw in a sketchbook? And then here's another section about going into detail on complementary stuff, concepts like split complementary, which is a very interesting topic if you're into color theory and things like that. I mean, it's A to Z. Here's another about the triad. And if you want to look at this definition, that's a really good place to start. But if you were interested, you could check out James Gurney's got a very cool, interesting video on triads. And also, he has a DVD on triads, so you could look there as well. But basically, Metzger has everything covered here from A to Z in his book, The Artist's Illustrated Encyclopedia, which I think is really cool and well worth the money. I think this was $30 US when I bought it, and I would buy it again. And it's published by Northlights Books, which you'll come to find out. And as we go through these books today, and as I've gone through books in the past, a lot of really good art books are published by Northlight Books. I want to thank them for publishing and giving these authors a chance to get their knowledge out in front of people. All right, so the way I want to go through this is kind of in order of kind of how you would progress as you learned about art and things like that, and what are the higher level concepts in art and things like that. So I just wanted to start with drawing, and I think it's interesting to start with figure drawing. Not for nothing, that's where I started. So I guess when I was a little kid, I just drew anything. But when I was at the Art Academy, I did a lot of figure sketching, and 10 years of it, actually. So, and people may say, wow, you spent a decade on that. How come you're not brilliant? Because, it takes a lot to become really, really good at figure sketching. But I wanted to talk about this book here. This is by Juliette Aristides, and it is Figure Drawing Atelier. So this is kind of like, it's a handbook. They call it a handbook, and this is a book where you probably could sketch right in it. I mean, they have blank pages, but I just kind of like to keep the book intact and pristine and not pollute it with my sketches. I can do that in a regular sketchbook. But anyway, this book is meant like as a learning book. So it goes through kind of the classic figure sketching stuff that you might expect, but it also talks about, and shows how to do that from beginning to end. Kind of, you've got the basic shape here and all that stuff, and then adding detail, finishing the rendering of the finished form. And that's really cool. And it also goes into gesture sketching, which is really important and a good practice for artists to kind of learn how to use your pencil like you're making musical notes. You're not so concerned about detail. And again, there's going to be a theme in these books we talk about a little bit today, and that is letting go of that desire or draw or attraction or seduction of getting to the detail right away, and think about more in terms of shapes and blocks and figures and gestures. And that kind of helps lift you away from wanting to get to that detail, because the easiest way to mess up a drawing or painting is to rush into detail right away. So anyway, on this gesture sketching, in this book, Figure Sketching Atelier, or Figure Drawing, they talk a little bit about how to do a gesture sketch. And really, it's just letting your pencil kind of find the lines in a figure very naturally. You're not worried about any detail at all. There's some examples of kind of gesture sketching. And I did quite a bit of that at the Art Academy, and it really helped. Another way to do figure sketching is do the cubed figure. You ever in an art store and you see those figures that you can buy and you can pose them, and those are kind of a little bit about what this is like. As a matter of fact, I think you can buy a cubed figure like that, but it helps to kind of have that figure around if you want to do sketching at home. But if you just want to do this kind of figure sketching, it just, again, helps you detach from all the detail and imagine the figure in different various shapes and blocks. And that's really important when you're learning art. And so I think this gives a good explanation of that and kind of helps you along that way. And then you talk about, like, if you're going to do portraiture or something, how to map the face and how to kind of, map the head in different, positions and things like that, kind of divide it up into sections so that it makes it easier for you as an artist to, do good work that way. So, and they do it with feet and hands as well. So there's a way you can section these off and just block them out. And I think these pages are left blank so that you can draw next to these, but might as well just open up a sketchbook and do the same. You can see it's almost a mechanical, machine-like drawing when you get to figuring out shapes and stuff in the human figure. But then, obviously you can soften it up and make it, more human-like. Here's a good example of a skull which starts as shapes. You block in the little shapes here. I think hopefully you can see those. And then you worry about adding all of this tonal value later on in the sketch. But really it's about these smaller sections and learning how to get those down first. And I think this book does a really good job of that. It's not a very expensive book either. I think it was $20 or something like that, $25. The Figure Drawing Atelier by Juliette Aristides. Good book. All of the books that I talk about and show today, if I can find them, they'll be in the listing below. Some may be out of print, just a heads up. And then there's this book here. This is another Juliette Aristides book, which goes into a little bit more, even more detail on how to do classical drawing. Now, this originally included a DVD tutorial. I don't know how many people still have DVD players, or you probably have a Blu-ray player that will play DVDs, but it used to have a DVD. I can't figure out where I put that now, but it comes with a DVD, and I'll show you in the back where it's got space for that. But if you look in the index here of the book, or the contents page, it talks about what this book runs through, and it's really comprehensive in terms of, how do you begin, then how do you get sort of relationships in your drawing, add contour and tonal composition, which is really important, adding the illusion of depth, and of course light and shadow. And whenever you take art classes or you learn art, there's sort of a system or process you go through to understand how to draw and sketch and paint. And these are kind of in the right order, I think. Again, this is like how you create these blocks and shapes and geometric figures inside of your sketch, and how you measure out things. And a lot of us in art school, or even learning on your own, this is a really important concept to understand, and that is concern yourself with the big shapes first, and the rest will follow. But if you can get the big shapes down, you're going to be miles ahead. Here's an example where she talks about establishing rhythm in your line work and how that might look. And even though those concepts may seem like out of reach if you don't really understand art or you're new to it, when you start to hear them and understand how they're applied, it really starts to galvanize or become much clearer in your mind. So what I like is that she gives examples of drawings and things like that, either classical or maybe more contemporary drawings that illustrate what she means when she says, what are the darkest parts of this drawing? Where are the shadows in it? You know, things like that. So, like, here's a really good example that I was looking at not so long ago, where there's really no detail. This is kind of line work in this. There's just line work down here. There's zero detail, but as you get into the focal point of this drawing here, you can see lots of really great detail in her face. And that came at the end. That work always comes at the end, if you're smart about how you do your drawing. Then she goes into the illusion of depth, which is another way of saying giving depth to your drawings or paintings, and talks a lot in detail about how to get that depth, and uses examples in both classical paintings and drawings, and as well either small or still life objects, landscapes, figures, things like that. I really like, and I think this is an example of Leonardo da Vinci's work. Michael Mentler, sorry. It looks like Da Vinci's work, but Michael Mentler did these hand studies, pen on toned paper, and you can see how there's very mechanical shapes in here by the bends of the fingers and stuff like that. This almost looks robotic in some ways if you look at some of the shapes, but it's really good to kind of learn where the bones and things are if you want to do that. I mean, there's people that spend their whole lives. This is a really good example where she places drawings in the book that show you exactly what she's talking about. So she's talking about composition here, and she's using examples from John Singer Sargent's Sketchbook. And then she's giving you an up-close view of those. And as you look at those, you can see some pretty extraordinary things going on in Mr. Sargent's notebook, Sketchbook. And he's doing these thumbnails, but this is a really good example of how you find composition. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then even when it comes to still lifes and things like that, she spends some time on that as well. Now, this is something I teach a lot in my class, is the sphere, and how to give a 2D flat object volume by using values on that object. And this is a really good example of how that's done, and really outlined well here, and very clear. And you can see it at work here in this drawing. Now, at some point at the Art Academy, I had to do this exercise where I just had a plaster cast statue of a horse, and I had to paint it in oil. So I had to first sketch it and then do an underpainting, and then, you know, do some thumbnails and all that stuff, and then use basically just 2 or 3 colors to render the horse head, which was fun to do, and I learned a lot by doing that. Here's another example where there's a thumbnail sketch or a tiny sketch side by side with the rendered piece, which is pretty cool, because this is like right here, this is the thumbnail sketch. And why is it important? Because you can find all of these things that you're able to glean from what you might do in advance of actually doing a finished piece. Lots of great examples in here of that stuff. And here's an example of, you know, finding the contour of a face and then kind of slowly using the shadows to add depth and volume to that. So Juliette Aristides, and this is a good book. It's called Lessons in Classical Drawing. And again, it did come with a DVD. I just don't have it handy. Can't find it. All right, so this is a very classic book here. This is called Keys to Drawing by Bert Dodson. And I think it was published the first time in like 1980 or so. I could be wrong about that. Oh, 85. Okay. So in 1985, this was first published. And Bert Dodson is a really good communicator when it comes to how to improve your sketching and drawing and stuff like that. Again, it's a Northlight Books publication, which thank you again to Northlights for giving artists such good opportunities. And if you look in the contents, you'll see kind of what he goes through in this book. The drawing process, the artist's handwriting, proportions, the illusion of light, the illusion of depth, the illusion of texture, pattern and design, and imagination. And I just wanted to highlight some of that in this book. So let's just turn here to the first thing I have tabbed out. And here's a good example of where you can take the simplest of objects. Of course, a lot of you won't see these anymore, and some of you watching won't even know what this is. But this is an old telephone. And so what Bert did is he took this telephone in its basic shapes, and then he started adding, different values to this thing to make it look more realistic. And then I kind of like how he did this, and I think this might be like a graphite wash or something. But even with pets, you can see it's the same thing, kind of pencil work, denoting the fur and things like that. And he goes through an explanation of how to do that. And I think that's really good. One of the other things that I teach that I think it's important that people learn right away when they're learning art is to understand tonal value. One of the really important things to learn when you're beginning your art journey is how to use tonal value in a drawing or painting. And the reason it's really, really important is that it's going to inform how you add volume and add volume and depth to your sketches or drawings or paintings. And so we practice this in the classes that I teach. We do a value scale, tonal scale, whatever you want to call it, but he called it a tonal bar, but it could be called a value scale. And then we talk about how do we translate what you've just done here into drawing a picture. And Bert kind of talks about that here in the hard edge and soft edge and that middle ground here where it needs to be soft to kind of show the blending of dark to light. It's a really important concept when you're learning art, and I'm glad that he covered it here. Another thing which I think is cool that a lot of art books don't have that Bert covered here, Mr. Dodson covered here was how to use your pencil to kind of judge the size of objects and the distance things are. So drawing by eye. So one of the things he talks about is how to use your pencil, extend your arm like this to, figure out how tall or short something is when you're sketching, or small or distant. And so he's got finding the midpoint, using plumb and level, using comparative measurements. So that's, I think, a really cool concept. And I still do this when I'm out field sketching. So it's a really important, I think, thing to remember when you're out there sketching, whether you've been doing it for years or you're just starting out. And then he talks a lot about how to create depth. And that depth is kind of, covered by learning perspective and how that things that are further away are going to tend to be lighter, and things that are closer in are going to tend to be darker. And he shows examples of that, which I really was thankful for in his book. Again, it's an older book, but it's got a lot of the basic concepts in clearly communicated ways. Again, I cannot emphasize that enough. There are a lot of books and authors out there that attempt to show the world how brilliant they are by basically peppering you with words and concepts that are very difficult to understand and grasp. And I just really prefer the artists. No offense to those people, they're probably brilliant, and they'd have to talk down to my level to help me understand, but I just like plain, direct, understandable, digestible, easy to apply instruction sets. So here we got the self-critique of your project. So what he has you do is go through a lesson at the end of each chapter and then really evaluate how you did. And even in that evaluation, you can learn a lot. So this is Keys to Drawing by Bert Dodson. It's a great book, and I recommend it highly. It was published in '85. I think you can still find these out there pretty inexpensively. All right, now we start to drift into concepts that are a little bit, I'd say, more deeper. So at the intermediate to advanced level, if you're just learning about how you've gotten the drawing down, you've gotten sketching down, you understand thumbnails, values, perspective, things like that, you're starting to see your drawing improved. And now you want to think about how to add light and shade. And one of the things that I've learned over the years is that regardless of whether it's pencil or watercolor or oil or acrylic or whatever the medium, if you want to apply light and shadow, the concepts underneath that are very similar. And if not quite the same, very, very similar. So this is a good book called Light and Shade in Watercolor, a different medium for drawing. This is in graphite, this is watercolor, but again, a lot of the concepts here will apply. And this is written by Hazel Soan. Soan, I think you pronounce her name. Light and shadow. That's really good shadow on that step there. But like, have you ever wondered, how would I paint water? How do I render that? How do I make that look like there's light in there and things like that? And there are definitely some tricks to that. But you can use dry brush, and there's also this stuff called masking fluid, where you kind of dot where you want the white to remain, then you paint over it, and then you scrape off this rubbery substance, and that's called masking fluid, and you can look it up. But a lot of what she does, and the other thing I really enjoy about her work, about Hazel Soan's work, is that it's kind of loose. It's not so serious. She's staying away from the detail in most of her work. Here's where she talks about values, light to dark values, and why it's important to really practice the range, if you can, of light to dark values in your work, and that'll help you understand more of the concepts, which I think is great. So she says, don't tidy it up too much. The life is in the brushstroke. And I think there's a lot to be said about that, because if you're already thinking about tidying up your work, you're probably into the detail. And if you're into the detail, you've probably gone too far. Talks about ratio of light to shade. And then here's a really good example of people gathered. She did a thumbnail sketch, and then she's kind of mapped out where she wants her color and shade to be, or light. So she's left some of the paper white there, or put a very light wash over some of the lighter spots. And, you can a lot of times see what you're going to do if you just do a simple like grayscale thumbnail here. Now you can do it in pencil, but if you can do it in watercolor, it's even better. Kind of shows you, she basically took this painting and then, turned it black and white. Let's see. And there's just some examples in this book of how to capture that light and shade. Like, you can definitely tell the light, where the light is coming from in these pictures. It's a really nice landscape, very loose, but a good book about light and shadow and shade by Hazel Soan. I recommend it. Take a look. This is a hardback, so it costs $29, but you might be able to find this in paperback actually for cheaper. And I wouldn't be, I'd be a little bit remiss if I didn't cover sort of landscapes and what's kind of helped me in terms of books, to understand and draw better landscapes. And this is a book called The Keys to Painting Trees and Foilage. And this is by Rachel Rubin Wolfe. And it says in all mediums. Again, this is a Northlight Books publication. And this was previously owned, so I got this secondhand. But you can see by the table of contents that the different things that are covered in the book. Now, the proper way to hold a pencil, which I actually teach in my class, because a lot of people are like, they come to a class having drawn, pictures during their lifetime, and they're just holding the pencil down on the very tip. And that really forces you into detail immediately. And I think what you want to do is back that off, hold the pencil as far away from the tip as you can, and work looser, because it helps to free your mind from that wanting to rush into the detail. Anyway, pencil methods, cross-hatching, all that stuff, painting trees, foliage and grasses, what works in terms of painting winter scenes and stuff like that, and then plein air versus studio painting. Well, not versus, she covers them both, but a lot about plein air. So again, there's some cross-hatching stuff here. There's just drawn with a carpenter's pencil, which is kind of cool. And then let's skip ahead here. I'm going to get into, a lot of people ask about how do I draw grasses and things like that. Now here's an interesting lesson, I guess. This is using masking fluid. So they're putting masking fluid down on the paper, they're painting it in the lines, and then as they darken the painting, and then eventually remove that masking fluid, they're left with these lines. There are other good ways to do this too. You can use a palette knife to kind of carve out the white spots of the grass when when your paint is still wet. Another thing you can do is dry brush technique is really good. So there's lots of different ways, but I thought this was an interesting example of the progression of that. And kind of takes this a couple of steps further and then shows you the bigger painting with that in there. And that's a really good example. Let's go here. One of the things I love to do is sketch trees. And whether it's winter, summer, spring, fall, doesn't matter. I love to sketch them all times of year. But she really goes into detail about how to add snow to trees, which I always think is interesting. First things first, though, the pencil work here you see in these trees is really good. And it would be good to sit and copy these pictures, which is okay when you're learning. It's fine to copy those pictures. You're not selling it, you're learning things. So and then she talks about how to draw a snowy landscape, but this is like a really favorite tree of mine and an example of how you can render this. There's a couple of little birds here sitting on this branch, but you can just leave these parts blank and, when you're sketching with your pencil, and it actually looks like snow is there, which is cool. There's an evergreen tree with some snow on it, hopefully freshly fallen, and then talks about how to do watercolor, shadows in watercolor, which is cool. Well, painting plein air, which I do a lot of. I try to get out and do a lot of this type of sketching and painting in my sketchbook, and so I was really interested to understand a little bit more about what they had to say about this. This is chapter 5, atmospheric perspective, and how to get perspective in your drawings and kind of reflect distance and perspective and proximity of objects. So a lot of that is explained along with these friendly tips and things like that for studio. And I really like how this is an excellent example of how the background of this picture is pushed way back by just toning down the values or colors. And then this tree here, this really bright tree in the sunlight, you can see the shadow there. It really pops in this drawing. It's the star of this painting. Painting. And then mood changes outdoors. So yeah, it covers a lot of that. And I think that's a really good and important book to keep on hand. I refer to this often, and it's called The Keys to Painting Trees and Foliage, edited by Rachel Rubin Wolf. All right, so now we're into the final book, and there's this guy named Ian Roberts who I found on YouTube. I just ran across him, and then as I started to watch a few of his videos and learn a little bit about more about who he was, I come to discover that he's a teacher as well as an author, and he's published some books and things like that. And I think you can learn things from people who have that kind of expertise. So I started following Ian, and I bought this book at some point. I thought it was a good investment after reading some reviews about it. And I'll just quick talk about this book. And this is a lot about composition, but a lot about other things as well. And we'll talk a little bit. There's Ian, the author. He's a Canadian guy. Up in the Great White North, they call it. So what is composition? Well, a lot of what they're talking about in terms of composition is the structure of your drawing and whether it meets the certain criteria to have a nice composition. And he goes into depth on this and talks about how to overcome some of the frustrations when you're trying to get a good composition in your drawing. And so, yeah, all of the basic language is covered there, if not a little highbrow, but the examples are really good. So here's an example of a page in a book which I think is pretty extraordinary and well laid out by Mr. Roberts. And I want to talk, what is going on? I want to talk a little bit about why it's really cool the way he laid this out. Well, for one thing, he talks about, you know, this is how you might progress as you're a sketcher or drawer or artist or what have you. You get out there and you represent things like trees as sticks. And then what he's saying is he's not only showing you how to design that a little bit better and give it a little bit more depth in the second example, he's kind of showing you what went wrong here. Same with this scene, right? You could draw around trees and you might even have the light right, but they just doesn't read real. And when you go over here, this is a much better way to render that same scene, a lot more realistic. Here's an example where he shows, you know, avoid attracting attention to the edges of the painting or drawing. These are kind of compositional basics, you know, how to keep things focused and to lead the viewer in. And here in this last example is a really good and really outstanding, I think, lesson in that, you know, he's drawn this scene twice. But in this scene, there's not so much cast shadow, there's not a depth to the objects, and you can see that. Now, this might be an advanced sketch for a basic, you know, artist who's learning or intermediate artist who's even been to a couple of years of art school. This might look just fine. But what he's showing you here is by adding the shadows, adding a little bit more tonal value, you're giving this depth and you're making this look even better. So, to the human eye. And he's got some really good examples, side-by-side examples, which this is part of what I really like about Ian Roberts' instructions. The other thing I like is that he does really good pencil renderings. I'm not, you know, no offense to Ian, I'm not so high on the painting stuff, but I think that the pencil renderings and how to communicate things through that is really good. Now, there's nothing wrong with his paintings. I'm not saying there is. They're just fine, but I'm saying I get more out of sort of the gradual understanding of how this is done in a pencil drawing. At some point, I'd probably be more interested in the painting stuff, but I'm practicing a lot of sketching in watercolor. So, and then he says, create interest and drama with value masses. So he's thinking about the mass in here, not the detail, again, the mass of things and how these tonal values matter and how that midtones play a role and things like that. And you can see that at work in one of Ian's paintings. This is a good example. Even here in a still life, this is another good example where you're not worried about making this look exactly like the photograph. You're thinking about how do I map out the light, shadow, tonal values in this thing. I really enjoy the sketch of this scene right here. This is a really good sketch and a good example. And I think at Ian Roberts, at his best, he is a really accomplished pencil artist who can show you what to do in a way that will make sense to you. Now, here's that scene we were looking at before, rendered a bit better. And he's talking about how do you just pick simple objects to make sure you're sketching on a daily basis, because you need to practice. Some basic drawing tips, which are really important. I love this, the vertical hatching in here and the show of light coming through here and all that stuff. That's just really important things that you can glean from looking at the examples. Here's another, with the pencil, judging the distance and stuff. That's really kind of cool. And he talks a lot about mapping things. And what I was really happy about Ian's book is that he goes into thumbnails, why they're important, why it's good to be patient with yourself, and why massing is important. And he's got a sketchbook system. He calls it a system, but I think it's what a lot of sketchers do. And then Plan big masses when you paint or draw or sketch or whatever you're doing with art. Plan big masses. Take these things you see and break them down into sections that you can deal with. And that's another way to avoid the cognitive overload of interpreting a scene and putting it into a sketchbook. So Ian Roberts, kudos for going over that stuff. Here's a good example of one of Ian's paintings. And again, I like, this is a brilliant painting. Love the use of light and shadow in here, where he's kind of put everything he's been teaching into this painting. Again, a very fine rendering, a very, very nice painting. And I'm just not there yet, but I really love the way he teaches that, especially with respect to oils. I can, manage myself okay in watercolors, but when it comes to oils, this is another level. It's really good. And you can see here's kind of where he's looking at some of those, kind of giving you an example of some of his paintings and work, where he's employed the lessons that he's trying to kind of share in this book. There's some really good quotes in here too. And he's got, I should mention quick about Ian Roberts. I don't know if he's still running this free weekly YouTube video, but he used to, and it's pretty good. I used to watch it quite a bit, and I've just been really busy lately. I need to catch up. And he's got some other books too. And then, of course, he teaches online. So, again, Ian Roberts, this is called Create Better Compositions by Design, and Mastering Composition by Ian Roberts, and How to Create Better Compositions by Design. $30 or $31 US. You may be able to find it used. I think I bought this directly from Ian's website. Again, it's a Northlight Books. So sometime I think it might be good to go check out Northlight Books. But anyway, that was Mastering Composition by Ian Roberts. We talked about Trees and Foilage here, edited by Rachel Rubin Wolf. Another good book. And then Hazel Soan's Light and Shade in Watercolor. You can find that out there on the internet currently. I don't know about Bert Dodson's book. I think it's still in publication. You can look it up. Keys to Drawing by Bert Dodson. Very good. Two books by Juliette Aristides, and those are Lessons in Classical Drawing, Essential Techniques from Inside the Atelier. It's a fancy French word for like school of learning. And then her Figure Drawing Atelier, complete with, you can sketch right in the book if you wanted to. And then, of course, Mr. Metzger's very nice, very excellent, The Artist's Illustrated Encyclopedia. I love this book. I probably use this book almost as much as I use many books. My most used book it's among the most used books in my collection of art books. I love referring to this, and sometimes when people are talking about stuff in a YouTube video, or I've forgotten a term or something like that, I can always turn to Mr. Metzger's book and look it up, and it's a 99.9% going to be there. So I really love that about the Illustrated Encyclopedia here. So that's been a good look at these books that are kind of instructional for art. Last time we looked at sketching. That's it. Thanks for joining me. So long for now. Bye-bye.